What will the future role of public space be? What are the new policies that public space needs?
A lot is going to depend on, I think, fundamental changes in zoning in North American cities and then in other cities around the world that goes much closer to more mixed use capacity for especially dense urban cores. And so the future of the public space plays into this because I think in the future we're going to see, I think partially as a result of the pandemic, this really transformation of the a lot of dense urban cores of cities around the world. And so, up until now, over the last 100 years or so, if you look at sort of zoning in the United States, began sort of just before the First World War. Basically, a skyscraper started to go up in New York, and you felt there was a need to protect against blotting out the sun and things like this. So zoning is almost a very sort of 20th, even 19th century construct, which divided, today artificially divides the city into public spaces, commercial areas, residential areas. So I think what we will see in the future, I believe, is more of a jumbling of these categories. And so there'll be a blurring of public space, of residential areas, commercial, etc. We're looking a lot about, for example, about what we call the proximity city in the future, which is that all of your needs really as a resident in a city can be met within 15 or 20 minutes walk from where you live. So your health care, commerce, education, public spaces, etc. And I think cities are going to be moving towards this. It's partially as a result of COVID and the sort of forced pace adoption of remote work, which is similar to exactly what we're doing on this Zoom conversation. So I think in the future there will be offices downtown, and people will commute to those offices in the morning and commute back in the evening to sort of suburbia, exurbia. But I think there'll be a lot less of that. There'll be a lot more remote working, etc. And that that will very much force change when it comes to zoning. So, and that affects public space. So I think cities also are looking more than ever about the well-being question. What is it to mean? What is a full life in a city? And public spaces are very much part of that. And I think cities, it's demonstrable that cities that do have substantial public space in which citizens can interact, etc., are successful cities that contribute to good work-life balance, etc., in an urban atmosphere. So yeah, I think one of the phenomena that we see, for example, is if you look at you take Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. There's a fascinating project now to transform an airbase, the King Salman Air Base, which is a military air base at the heart of the city, to decommission it and to make it a massive public park. I think it would be 4 times the size of Central Park. In Dallas, Texas, the same phenomenon is happening with the Trinity River Conservancy, which is also, I think, right now the largest public park in North America. It's right in the heart of Dallas. So we see this happening more and more. A real focus on public space, also developing public space sometimes with the private sector. So if you look at the High Line project in New York, which is a very, very good example of the sort of successful adaptive reuse of sort of old infrastructure into something that's very cutting edge and modern. It's one of the most successful public spaces now in Lower Manhattan. And that began as really a public-private partnership. So, we're going to see more of these new kinds of models, I think, in the future.
In developing this idea of the proximity city, what do you think the impact of gentrification will be? How much is okay, and how will this affect access to public space?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in some ways, is a related question is what happens to the whole conversation around gentrification now. Because I think we may be in a situation where you have, frankly, reverse gentrification, because we're at the precipice of a fairly major economic crisis that is very much focused on cities, by the way. So it's not clear to me where that conversation goes now. But what I can say is when planners now think about more reuse, adaptive reuse, I think the equity part of the discussion is much more important now than it was a few years ago. And that is also a result of just, the changing political climate in the United States anyway, following, Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And so it's definitely part of the conversation, but I think in some ways the bigger challenge is going to be degentrification in cities, because we're going to have, an entirely new class of sort of urban poor as a result of the economic crisis following the pandemic, unfortunately.
And what do you think about all those things about going more dense because of the environmental aspects? And the other question is that how do you imagine the negative impacts of this proximity cities that you're talking about? Could it become like suburban areas, like gated communities, a little bit shifting to the negative impacts, or you're seeing it as a positive move on from this situation?
If it starts to be gated, then that would be really wrong. And I think that would be going completely in the wrong direction. No, I think this is a very positive development, potentially, if it's handled in the right way. By the way, regarding density, I think it's a double-edged sword because, on the one hand, we've seen that cities are the big cauldrons of pandemic infection because they are so dense and people just congregate and the infection spreads rapidly. But we know that, dense cities are also efficient from the point of view of carbon emissions. And if you spread out the same number of people to sort of exurbia, that's much more damaging for the environment than, dense concentrated cities. So, I think we'll have to look at this. But one of the things that I think has to come out of this crisis, and that we were already on the path to it, is just less use of individually owned internal combustion engine cars. And, if you look at the spatial organization of cities over the past 100 years, they're completely built around the motor car. So I think what's going to be interesting is, are we going to begin to see cities now in the first third of this 21st century developed along on principles other than that of efficiency for prioritizing motor car? So if you look at Neom, for example, which is the big planned city in Saudi Arabia that I'm associated with, that's quite interesting because it's modeled and it's designed in the master plan, on which Tom Main has done a lot of work. It's essentially a post-car city. And in fact, in many ways, it's the world's first post-car city. So the transit within Neom will not be by individually owned internal combustion engine vehicles, but rather by vehicles that do not emit any carbon, so electric or or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, a very heavy reliance on autonomous shared transportation. So I think, and as a result, the whole spatial organization of Neom is going to be radically different from probably any other city in the world, because you won't have, broad boulevards that are designed to make as efficient thoroughfares for cars. It's going to be another kind of system. So I think we're going to see more and more of that, and we already see in European cities a move towards pedestrianization of thoroughfares. Milan, Madrid, Paris certainly, and Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, has really put an emphasis on this. And that also goes towards the proximity city, because, you want to have your life sort of around you.
What will be the future role of our streets? What will be the new forms of human transportation?
I mean, I think one of the interesting things that we look at now is not only how human beings move around a city, but even more importantly, in a way, is how goods and packages move around a city, the logistics side of things. Because if you look at traffic, for example, in downtown Manhattan, it's probably the worst traffic in the world. And it's large. It's not because, you, Emiliano, are trying to get from point A, point B. It's because someone is trying to deliver a package to Emiliano at your house, along with 1,000 other package deliveries on that street, because everybody's now ordering from Amazon Pantry or Amazon or Walmart, or promising delivery within 2 hours. So right now there's complete chaos. So the question is, how do you organize that efficiently in the future? So one way is going to be an increasing use of robotic delivery bots. And there are many, many projects looking at this, and they're, also some are being commercialized. So it's an autonomous robot that goes up to your door and essentially delivers you a package and then returns to wherever. We're going to see a lot of that. There's also how you organize the curb. Curb space is going to be one of the big battles in cities going forward, and who is going to, who owns the curb and who manages it, who gets the rent from the curb. I think ultimately will be cities. But there's a big tug of war between cities, between operators, between delivery operators for that very precious space, which is the curb. So we're going to have to come up with sort of more rational solutions for organizing that. That will be interesting to watch.
And in terms of public transportation, what do you think about that?
Well, look, it depends, because if we go to a world in which there will be less commuting from exurbia to, downtown business districts in the morning and returning in the evening, we're going to have to rethink, reprioritize certain lines in public transit. I think, it depends. I think Los Angeles, for example, has a huge build out of public transportation following the Measure M vote. I think because of COVID and the move to more remote working, I think some of that's going to have to be rethought. I think certainly LA Metro, for example, and other transit authorities in the world certainly have to rethink. I think they should look more at the Asian model, which is commercially developing nodes, stations, transit stations. Right now in Los Angeles, for example, commerce is not allowed in a metro station. You can't buy a newspaper, you can't buy a Coke if you're thirsty, you can't buy something to eat. And you compare that, for example, with any kind of any public station in a Japanese city, which are, almost shopping malls. And they subsidize, probably the world's best transit system. It's low cost, it's efficient, etc. And it can be low cost and efficient because they're getting the rent from other sources of revenue. I think that's a good model. But
What should be the role of technology and AI in rethinking the possibilities for public space? Can AI be used to control parts of the city according to unexpected events?
I would say most definitely yes. I mean, I think AI is, incredibly important. It will be more and more important in how cities are managed. That said, I think there is clearly a big issue around privacy, and that's a cultural issue. It depends what the cultural norms are and the societal norms around privacy, because there's a very different view, for example, in China, Singapore, Japan, versus Europe versus the United States. So we all have quite different views about privacy, access to data, etc. So, China, you have relatively few concerns, I would say, about privacy. And, the state has access essentially to everything. I mean, here in the United States, it's, there's much more concern about access to personal data. Europe, there's even more, they're even more radical about it. So I think it depends on that a lot. But, AI, what's not to like? I mean, in terms of organizing traffic and mobility around a city, AI is more and more essential. And AI in the future, I mean, if you think of autonomous mobility, autonomy is artificial intelligence applied to mobility. I mean, essentially, AI is what a company like Waymo or Cruise, any of the big autonomous vehicle players, AI is a key part of what they do. So that's really important. Yeah, and I think the other area where I think AI is really important is in facilitating the feedback loop between urban residents and urban authorities. So AI also gives you the ability to have potentially have a kind of seamlessness in the communication between, how I alert public officials that there's a pothole in the street in front of my house, and making sure that when I alert the city that they will understand that request or that call for help, that it'll be dealt with in a timely fashion, etc. AI is a very important part of that feedback loop that's essential to the good functioning of the city.
Do you think that the creation of this feedback loop should also include public-private partnerships, or do you think it should be solely a public thing?
I think it will always, of course, it will involve private players, and there will be, and I think that's one of the interesting things about cities going forward, is that so much of the activity will be in public-private partnerships. And one of the reasons, by the way, and it's also an unfortunate side effect of COVID, is that it's completely fiscally hollowed out almost every city in the world, particularly in the United States. So city budgets are going to have to be slashed radically in coming years. So the only way that it will really be possible to roll out new kinds of services will be in partnership with the private sector, in which there's a kind of a sharing of some potential future rent.
Do you think that the interests of corporations would have like any kind of conflict with this? I think that's been a critique.
Look, I think, as long as the public good is protected through, smart regulations, smart antitrust regulations, I don't see the problem. Honestly. I mean, for example, and as long as things are transparent. So, for example, a few weeks ago, Marin County, north of San Francisco, the transit authority up there, cut a deal, I think a year-long deal with Uber. So they pay Uber, I don't know how many millions of dollars, per quarter or per semester. So now, if you're taking public transit up into Marin County and you need to get the last mile from the station to your house, you can do it by Uber. and you don't pay Uber. It's really the taxpayer that's paying Uber. But if it's done transparently, that's a net plus for the city. It's good for Uber. It's good for the city. It's good for residents. It improves mobility there. That's interesting because yes, absolutely. Because one of the fascinating things about mobility is that urban mobility is how quickly it's changing. Mm. And so, for example, I think there's a chapter in my book about urban air mobility. I think that would probably be 2 chapters now. I mean, I think that's becoming more and more of a reality every day, and that's going to be interesting. That in my lifetime, within a very few years, instead of getting in my car to go from Santa Monica to downtown, let's say 12 miles, or getting on a metro station, I will just use my phone and call a robotic electric air taxi, which will pick me up and take me to downtown in 5 minutes, in a low altitude ride over Los Angeles. And so I think that's a reality that's going to come more quickly than we think, and will be very very transformative to the future geography of cities. So that's one big thing. I think, obviously my book didn't take into account the COVID and what we were talking about earlier, and the sort of the move towards remote working, which I think is here to stay to a large extent. So that will certainly change commuting patterns in cities, etc. So that is something that would be very, very different. Well, look, I mean, I think if you go back sort of 5 or 6 or 7 years, if you said smart city, what that would have meant back then is a very centrally planned city in which there's one urban control room. It's very much the IBM view of a smart city, and in fact, that's what they brought to Rio de Janeiro, for example. There's a single command room which governs traffic and all sorts of different things in Rio. I think what we've all learned is, reliance on one vendor is not a good idea. 2, building a very centralized approach like that is actually quite inefficient and extremely expensive. And, for a city like Rio is not, it's not Paris. It doesn't have unlimited resources. So it's been a real issue for that. So I think, we're going to see more kind of decentralized smart city solutions in which, what does smart city mean? It means essentially that you have connected infrastructure, you have sensors that can help manage the city in more efficient ways. That doesn't have to be centralized. So I think what you see now, and it's really generalized around the world, is city officials becoming more and more technologically competent. Because I would say up until 5, 6, 7 years ago, city officials did not understand data, did not understand sensors, did not understand Internet of Things. It's very different now, and every day brings more and more technological sophistication on the part of cities. And I think that's really encouraging, because they're understanding how powerful some of these tools can be. And they're also able now, and this is for the first time, city officials are able to speak to the IBMs, the Siemens, the Ubers, the Birds, as at the same level. Because if you look at Uber, for example, when Uber burst out of nowhere, 7, 8 years ago, they just started operations in cities without asking the city. And the city would then have to kind of retrofit a regulatory framework to fit that in. Now, a Bird the same way. I mean, they would just, pick a city, put in 1,000 Bird scooters, and then try to figure it out. That, I think, is not happening anymore. In the future, for operators, whether it's mobility, telecom, other kinds of urban services, have to deal with the city. And I think it's becoming easier and easier because the city now gets technology more than ever. And every day, there's more and more sophistication. That's a real difference. So.
Which is the actual aim of building this new city from ground zero?
Yeah. I mean, the way they see it is as a very heavy emphasis on technology, plus a regulatory framework that's extremely open, extremely business friendly. And so it's already similar. It's an extraterritorial space. So it will have its own legal framework, et cetera, that I think, we've been looking at sort of best case legal structures from around the world and taking what we think works best. So I think the idea is to attract, knowledge workers, innovators from around the world. Say, come here. There's very smart regulations, very lightly regulated. The currency is Bitcoin based. There's very attractive legal framework about making investments, et cetera. So it's the interesting thing about NEOM is that it's in the northwest quadrant of the country. It's been completely undeveloped until now, but very much, if you look on a map, it's much more part of the Mediterranean space and sort of Europe than it is of the Persian Gulf or the Arab Gulf, whatever you wanted to call it. So I think it's sort of a projection into Europe in some ways. I mean, it's a 2.5-hour plane ride from Rome or Paris to NEOM. 3 hours, I guess. So it's sort of that general space. And I think that's, and by the way, 50 kilometers from NEOM is, the big Silicon Valley of the whole area, which is Israel. It's right there. So I think, partially development of NEOM has to do with, a very long-term strategic view of where the Middle East is going.
When is going to be finished or running?
Well, I mean, it's officially started, so I think over the next 10 years is the time frame for putting in this sort of huge amount of infrastructure that's needed.
In terms of extraterritorial spaces, what do you see as the future with all that? After NEOM?
Well, I think there are a lot of examples around the world, whether it's Shenzhen, Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong's a kind of counterexample now for unfortunate reasons, but Jebel Ali. I mean, you have a recognition that maybe that kind of works. Carving out a completely sort of independent regulatory framework for a greenfield urban development can make sense, because it frees you from, reliance on the sort of the legal system of the country in which you operate. I don't know if you've probably heard of the Charter City movement, which is essentially very, very similar, but it's saying, okay, give us, 50 square miles of Honduras or Colombia, and we'll build a city, but we'll also be self-administering sort of legal framework, et cetera. I think that has a lot of merit. Yeah. And also, I think we're going to a situation in which, if you look at even existing cities like London and Paris, New York, are looking at changes in the regulatory framework that will allow them potentially to attract innovators in ways particular to them. So like in London, when Brexit happened for Britain, or it looked like, it was going to happen, the London authorities started, under Sadiq Khan, the mayor, started looking at a London visa. So actually a visa that the city of London would give a Bulgarian or a Spaniard or an Argentinian or a French to allow them to come to London and, you know, set up shop and be entrepreneurs. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, you know, and that cities are going to be more and more where the sort of action is. Thank you very much. It's been a lot
Thank
of
you
fun.
for your time.
Thank you
Yes,
so
thank
much.
you.
It was a pleasure meeting you.
Yeah.
Really
Thanks. Take
interesting.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.